He thought saving his company was the end of the story. But when the billionaire ordered a background check on the quiet waitress who had rescued his empire, what he uncovered made his blood run cold. The sabotage wasn't finished. It hadn't even truly begun. Because the real enemy wasn't outside the company.
He was still inside the building.
And the woman who had solved everything in seconds had been waiting years for this moment. You asked what happened next. This is where everything changed. Welcome back to Ariella Stories. I'm so glad you're here, and if you thought part 1 was intense, this episode goes much deeper. By the time Richard Wilson closed the file on his screen, he already knew one thing for certain. Saving his company had been the easy part. What terrified him now was discovering why she had helped him in the first place. 4 days after TechVision's IPO launched successfully at $42 per share, Richard Wilson sat alone in his corner office at 6 in the morning, staring at a personnel file that shouldn't have raised any red flags. But something about Michelle Armstrong's background check kept nagging at him, a feeling he'd learned to trust after 15 years building companies from nothing. The facts were straightforward enough. Georgia Tech graduate, top of her class, master's degree in computer science with a specialty in financial algorithms and predictive modeling. She'd received job offers from Microsoft, Amazon, Goldman Sachs, and 3 major hedge funds before she'd even defended her thesis. Her professors had written recommendations that used words like exceptional, once in a generation, and brilliantly intuitive. But then there was a gap, 18 months where Michelle Armstrong had simply vanished from the professional world. No LinkedIn updates, no conference presentations, no published papers. For someone on her trajectory, that kind of silence wasn't just unusual.
It was a warning sign.
Richard had asked his head of human resources to dig deeper, to find out what had happened during those missing months. The report that came back made him set down his coffee cup with hands that had started to shake. Medical debt. Over $380,000. Michelle's mother Grace had died of breast cancer 18 months ago, leaving behind bills that had consumed everything the family owned. Her younger brother Aaron, 24 years old, was in end-stage kidney failure, barely surviving on inadequate dialysis because they couldn't afford better treatment. The family had lost their home, their savings, their health insurance. Everything. But that wasn't what made Richard's hands shake. It was the paragraph buried in the middle of the financial history section, a detail his HR director had flagged as potentially relevant. Before Grace Armstrong's cancer diagnosis, before the medical bills, the family had already been financially devastated. 7 years ago, Grace had invested her entire retirement savings with a financial advisor who'd promised guaranteed returns of 12% annually. The advisor had been running a Ponzi scheme, stealing from dozens of middle-class families. When the scheme collapsed, Grace had tried to recover her money through the courts, but the advisor had hidden his assets in offshore accounts and disappeared. The civil case had gone nowhere. Grace Armstrong had lost $73,000, her entire life savings, with no recourse and no justice. Richard's eyes locked on the name of the financial advisor, Michael Hendricks. He read it 3 times, feeling cold spread through his chest.
Hendricks.
The same last name as Courtney, his CFO, the woman they'd caught sabotaging TechVision just days ago. The woman who was now in FBI custody awaiting trial. What Richard didn't know yet was that this connection was only the first layer of a truth that went much deeper than he was prepared for. He immediately called Agent Sarah Quisenberry, the FBI investigator handling Courtney's case. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. Richard explained what he'd found, reading her the relevant passages from Michelle's background check. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Agent Quisenberry spoke again, her voice had changed, taking on the careful neutrality of someone who'd just realized a case was much bigger than she'd initially thought. Mr. Wilson, I need you to send me that file immediately. And I need you to not discuss this with anyone, including Michelle Armstrong, until I can verify some information.
Can you do that?
Richard agreed, feeling dread building in his stomach. He sent the file and spent the next 2 hours trying to focus on work while his mind kept circling back to the same questions. Was it coincidence that Michelle had been working a few blocks from his office? Was it chance that she'd spotted the error in his code that night? Or had something else been happening? Something he'd completely missed? At 8:30, Agent Quisenberry called him back. Her voice was grim. Michael Hendricks is Courtney's father. We've known about him for years. He's been running sophisticated financial frauds for over 2 decades, but he's careful, always operating through intermediaries and shell corporations. We've never been able to build a case strong enough to charge him. Courtney's arrest was our first real break, but even now, Michael is insulated. He can claim he had no knowledge of his daughter's actions. Richard felt his world tilt. So the man who destroyed Michelle's family is the father of the woman who tried to destroy my company. That cannot be coincidence. Agent Quisenberry was quiet for a moment.
No, it's not.
We've been analyzing Courtney's seized computers overnight. We found files related to Michelle Armstrong, surveillance notes going back 6 months. Courtney knew who Michelle was. She'd been monitoring her. Richard's blood ran cold. Monitoring her? Why? The agent's voice stayed careful and professional. We're still analyzing the full scope, but it appears Courtney viewed Michelle as a potential threat. Someone with the skills and motivation to uncover connections between current and past Hendricks family operations. The surveillance was probably meant to ensure Michelle stayed contained in her circumstances, too busy surviving to investigate. Richard stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. The sun was rising, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. It should have been beautiful, but all he could think about was Michelle, brilliant and desperate, working double shifts at a restaurant while being watched by the very people who had destroyed her family. When Michelle fixed my code that night, Richard said slowly, when she saved my company, Courtney would have known almost immediately. Is that why the sabotage escalated? Agent Quisenberry confirmed his suspicion. We believe so. Michelle's intervention changed the dynamic. Instead of being a contained threat, she'd become an active problem. Someone inside TechVision with the skills to potentially uncover the full scope of Courtney's operations. That's likely why Courtney planted the IPO reporting error, the one Michelle caught. It was meant to be catastrophic and untraceable back to internal sabotage. Richard felt sick. So Michelle walked into a trap. Everything that happened, her helping me, getting hired as a consultant, it put her directly in Courtney's crosshairs. There was another pause. Then Agent Quisenberry said something that made Richard's world shift again. Mr. Wilson, there's something else you need to know. We found email correspondence between Courtney and her father from 3 weeks ago. They discussed Michelle Armstrong specifically. And based on the content of those emails, we believe Michelle might already know about the connection between the Hendricks family and what happened to her mother. In fact, we think she may have known before she ever spoke to you in that restaurant. Richard sat in stunned silence, processing those words. Michelle might have known. She might have known who Courtney was, who her father was, what they'd done to her family. Which meant everything that had happened might not have been chance or coincidence. It might have been deliberate.
Planned.
You're saying Michelle helped me because she knew Courtney was involved? Richard asked slowly. That she was trying to get inside my company to expose her? Agent Quisenberry's voice was measured. We can't be certain of her motivations without speaking to her directly. But the timeline suggests she may have identified the connection between Courtney and Michael Hendricks before approaching you. The question is, how much did she know? And what was her plan? Richard thought back to that night in the restaurant, replaying every detail in his mind. Michelle's hesitation before speaking up, the way she'd carefully explained the error without revealing too much about her own capabilities, her initial reluctance to accept his job offer. Had all of that been calculation? Had she been playing a role getting close to him to gain access to Courtney? The thought should have made him angry. It should have felt like betrayal. But instead, Richard found himself feeling something entirely different. Understanding. If someone had destroyed his family, stolen everything he loved, and then that person's daughter had tried to destroy his life's work, wouldn't he do exactly what Michelle had done? Wouldn't he use every skill, every opportunity, every advantage to make sure they finally faced consequences? Richard made his decision. I need to talk to her.
Now.
Before this goes any further, I need to hear her side of this. Agent Quisenberry started to object, but Richard cut her off. She saved my company. She caught sabotage that could have destroyed everything I've built. Whatever her motivations were, whatever she knew or didn't tell me, she helped me when she didn't have to. I owe her the chance to explain. There was a long pause. Then the agent sighed.
Fine.
But I'm sending 2 agents to be present. And Mr. Wilson, be careful. If Michelle Armstrong has been planning something for months, you might not know her as well as you think. Richard called Michelle and asked her to come to his office immediately. She arrived 20 minutes later, looking tired but alert. She'd been working 18-hour days conducting the security audit he'd assigned her, strengthening TechVision's systems against future attacks. When she walked into his office and saw the 2 FBI agents standing beside his desk, her expression changed. Not to fear or surprise, but to something else entirely. Resignation. Like she'd been expecting this moment and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. You found out, Michelle said quietly. It wasn't a question. Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit down, please. We need to talk about Michael Hendricks and what you knew before you helped me. Michelle sat slowly, her hands folded in her lap. For a long moment, she didn't speak. When she finally looked up at Richard, her eyes were clear and steady. I knew who Courtney was, she said. I knew she was Michael Hendricks' daughter. I'd been tracking the Hendricks family for 2 years, trying to find evidence that could be used to prosecute them for what they did to my mother and other victims. I knew Courtney worked at TechVision. I knew your company was planning an IPO. And I got the job at the Sterling Oak restaurant specifically because it was close to your office, because I'd researched your patterns and knew you ate there when you were stressed. Richard felt his chest tighten. So that night when you fixed my code, that wasn't spontaneous. You were waiting for an opportunity to approach me. Michelle shook her head firmly.
No.
That part was real. I was hoping to eventually find a way to talk to you, to warn you about Courtney. But I didn't know there was an error in your code until I saw it on your screen. That was genuine. Everything I told you about my background, about my family, about why I was working as a waitress, all of that was completely true. The only thing I didn't tell you was that I'd been investigating Courtney Hendricks and that I already knew who had destroyed my family. One of the FBI agents stepped forward. Ms. Armstrong, why didn't you bring your suspicions about Courtney to the authorities? If you believed she was involved in criminal activity, why not report it? Michelle's voice was steady, but edged with bitterness. Because I tried that years ago. After my mother died, after we discovered she'd been scammed by Michael Hendricks, I went to the police, to the FBI, to anyone who would listen. And I was told the same thing over and over. The statute of limitations had passed. The evidence was insufficient. Michael Hendricks had disappeared offshore and couldn't be touched. There was nothing anyone could do. So I learned to do it myself. I taught myself financial forensics. I spent 2 years tracking the Hendricks family's operations through public records and data analysis. I identified their patterns, their shell corporations, their methods. And when I found out that Courtney Hendricks was CFO of a major tech company preparing for an IPO, I knew that would be their next target. I knew she'd try to sabotage it for profit. So I positioned myself to be there when the time came. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Michelle's face carefully. You used me. You used my company as bait to catch Courtney. Michelle met his eyes without flinching.
Yes.
I'm sorry for the deception, but I'm not sorry for what I did. Courtney Hendricks is a criminal. Her father is a criminal. They've destroyed hundreds of families over 2 decades. And the only way to stop them was to catch them in the act of committing new crimes. Your company was already their target. I didn't create that situation. I just made sure that when they made their move, someone would be there to stop them. The room was silent for a long moment. Richard could feel the FBI agents watching him, waiting to see how he'd react. He should have been angry. Michelle had manipulated him, used his crisis for her own purposes, kept crucial information hidden. But when he looked at her, sitting there with her chin raised and her eyes steady, all he could think about was what she'd been through. Her mother dying in debt and shame. Her brother slowly failing from lack of proper medical care. 2 years of poverty and desperation, while the people responsible lived in luxury. And through all of that, instead of breaking, instead of giving up, She'd taught herself what she needed to fight back. She'd positioned herself, waited patiently, and when the opportunity came, she'd acted with precision and courage. Think about what that takes. 2 years of watching your brother suffer. 2 years of hiding your intelligence behind a waitress apron. 2 years of getting close enough to the fire without burning. Would you have lasted 2 days? The error in my code, Richard said slowly. The one you fixed in 3 minutes. If you hadn't been there that night, if you hadn't spoken up, what would have happened? Michelle's voice was quiet. Your IPO would have failed catastrophically. Your company would have been destroyed. Thousands of people would have lost their jobs. Investors would have lost millions. And Courtney and Michael Hendricks would have profited enormously from the chaos. Richard nodded slowly. So you saved my company. Regardless of your motivations, regardless of what you knew or didn't tell me, you saved everything I'd built. That's not in question. He turned to the FBI agents. She's been conducting a private investigation for 2 years, gathering information that none of you managed to find. Instead of viewing her as an obstruction, maybe you should view her as an asset. She knows more about how the Hendricks family operates than anyone in this room. So here's what's going to happen. Michelle is going to share everything she knows with you. Every piece of information she's gathered, every pattern she's identified. And in return, you're going to bring her into this investigation officially. Because this isn't finished yet, is it? Agent Quisenberry exchanged a glance with her colleague. No, it's not finished. We've arrested Courtney, but Michael Hendricks is still free. Still operating offshore. We need evidence that directly connects him to recent criminal activity. Something that can't be explained away or blamed on his daughter acting independently. Richard turned back to Michelle. Can you help with that? Do you have information that could lead to Michael Hendricks' arrest? Michelle's expression changed. Something fierce and deeply determined came into her eyes. I have 2 years of research. I know his patterns, his associates, his methods. I know how he communicates, how he moves money, how he insulates himself from direct involvement. And I think I know how to make him expose himself. But it's risky. It would require using tech vision as bait again, creating a situation where Michael thinks he can profit from our destruction. We'd have to make him believe Courtney's sabotage is still working, that we haven't caught her yet. We'd have to let him think he's winning. Richard felt a slow smile come to his face. You want to set a trap? Michelle nodded. A very specific, very controlled trap. One that forces Michael to coordinate directly with his criminal network, to give orders that can be documented, to move money in ways that prove intent. We make him commit crimes in real time while the FBI watches and records everything. And when we have enough evidence, when there's no possible way he can escape prosecution, we close the trap and make sure he pays for everything he's done. Not just to my family, but to everyone he's ever hurt. Over the next 3 hours, Michelle laid out her plan in meticulous detail. She pulled up spreadsheets and diagrams on Richard's monitors, showing the network of shell corporations and offshore accounts that Michael used to hide his money and coordinate his criminal operations. She explained how Michael had built his entire enterprise around one core principle: plausible deniability. He always stayed one step removed from actual criminal acts, always had someone else execute the plans he designed, always left himself a clean exit. That's why he's never been caught, Michelle explained. He's patient. He's careful. He never gets his own hands dirty. But he also can't resist controlling his operations. He micromanages through encrypted communications and coded language. If we create a crisis big enough, urgent enough, he won't be able to stay on the sidelines. He'll have to get involved directly. And when he does, we'll have him. Agent Quisenberry studied the information Michelle was presenting, her expression shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. You're suggesting we fake a catastrophic failure at TechVision. Make it look like Courtney's sabotage is still working even though she's arrested. Make Michael think his plan is succeeding so he coordinates the final stages himself. Michelle nodded.
Exactly.
We create a controlled crisis. A security breach that appears to expose TechVision's proprietary technology. We leak it to the press, let the stock price start falling. Michael's network of short sellers will see the opportunity. They'll move to profit from the chaos. And Michael will have to coordinate those moves, give orders, transfer money. Every action he takes will be documented evidence of criminal conspiracy. Richard could see the logic, but he also saw the enormous risk. You're talking about deliberately crashing my company's stock price. Even in a controlled environment, real investors will panic. The damage to TechVision's reputation could be permanent. Michelle met his eyes directly. I know. And that's exactly why this has to be your decision. I'm asking you to risk everything you've built to help catch the man who destroyed my family. That's not fair. But it's the only way I can see to make sure Michael Hendricks finally faces real consequences. So I need you to decide if justice for hundreds of victims is worth the risk to your company. The room went silent. Richard thought about everything he'd built over 15 years. TechVision was his life's work, his legacy. The idea of deliberately putting it at risk was almost physically painful. But then he thought about Grace Armstrong, dying in debt and believing she'd failed her children. He thought about Michelle, working double shifts while her brother slowly failed, never giving up on her fight for justice. He thought about the hundreds of other families Michael Hendricks had destroyed, people who'd never seen consequences for the person who hurt them. We do it, Richard said. But we build this trap so carefully, so precisely, that there's no chance of it backfiring. We protect our employees, our real investors, our clients. And we make absolutely sure that when we close the trap, Michael Hendricks has no way out. Michelle's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. Richard shook his head quietly. I think I do. This is about more than justice for your family. It's about making sure your mother's death meant something. I understand that better than you know. Over the next 12 days, Michelle worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life. She built what she privately called the digital cage, a completely isolated mirror of TechVision's core systems that looked identical to the real infrastructure from the outside, but contained no actual client data or functional code. She created false access points that would make it appear as though hackers had breached TechVision's security when they were really just accessing the dummy system. She generated fake proprietary algorithms that looked extraordinarily valuable but were completely meaningless, designed specifically to be stolen in the staged breach. The technical challenge was immense, but Michelle attacked it with focused intensity because every line of code she wrote brought her one step closer to the justice her mother had never received. She worked 20-hour days, sustained by coffee and the knowledge that Aaron was finally getting the medical care he needed. His condition had stabilized significantly under the treatment Richard's health plan now covered. For the first time in 2 years, Aaron had a real future ahead of him. Meanwhile, Richard prepared his executive team for what he described as a major security stress test, telling them TechVision needed to be ready for sophisticated attacks now that they were a high-profile public company. He didn't mention the FBI or the trap they were building. The fewer people who knew the full truth, the less chance of something leaking to the wrong ears. And with Michael Hendricks still watching from the Cayman Islands, every detail mattered. Agent Quisenberry worked with federal prosecutors to ensure every aspect of their plan was legally sound. They obtained warrants to monitor Michael's communications and financial transactions. They positioned agents to document his activities in real time. They coordinated with international law enforcement in 3 countries, preparing to move the moment Michael committed crimes they could prove in court. On the 12th day, everything was ready. The digital cage was built and tested. The FBI's monitoring systems were in place. The financial press had been primed with carefully planted rumors about potential security concerns at TechVision. And Richard had scheduled a major investor presentation for the following morning, announcing a new product launch. Maximum visibility. Maximum opportunity for Michael to show his hand. The night before execution day, Michelle sat in her apartment with Aaron, who'd been released from the hospital while awaiting transplant evaluation results. He looked better than he had in months, color returning to his face, real energy in his movements. Hope looked good on him. Big day tomorrow? Aaron asked, seeing the tension in his sister's shoulders.
Really big, Michelle said.
Could change everything. Aaron studied her face carefully. You've been different lately. More like yourself. Like the person you were before Mom got sick. It's good to see. Michelle felt her throat tighten. I'm working on something important. Something connected to what happened to Mom. I can't give you all the details yet, but soon,
Really soon.
you're going to understand that what happened to our family wasn't random bad luck. And the people responsible are going to face real consequences. Erin reached over and squeezed her hand. I trust you. You've kept us alive for 2 years when I didn't think we'd make it. If you say it's going to be okay, I believe you. That night, Michelle lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about her mother. Grace Armstrong had spent 30 years teaching kindergarten children to believe the world was fair and that honesty mattered. Michael Hendricks had weaponized that faith against her, used her trust to steal everything she'd spent a lifetime building. And when Grace had died, she died feeling ashamed, feeling foolish, feeling like she'd failed the 2 children who needed her most. But tomorrow, that narrative was going to change permanently. Tomorrow, the world would learn that Grace Armstrong hadn't been foolish. She'd been the victim of a professional predator who had done this to hundreds of other people. And her daughter had spent 2 years making sure that predator would never hurt anyone again. Michelle's phone buzzed at 5 a.m. A text from Richard. You ready? She typed back without hesitation. Ready. Let's end this. At 6 a.m., Michelle arrived at TechVision's headquarters. At 9:45, 15 minutes before the investor presentation was scheduled to begin, Michelle executed the first phase of the plan. She triggered the fake security breach, setting off automated alerts that appeared to warn of unauthorized access to TechVision's most sensitive systems. Within minutes, carefully planted posts appeared on financial forums, anonymous messages suggesting something was seriously wrong inside TechVision. The posts spread immediately through day trading communities and market analysis channels. By 9:55, the first news alerts were hitting screens. Reports of a potential security breach at TechVision Dynamics. Unconfirmed sources suggesting proprietary algorithms may have been compromised. At 10 a.m., Richard walked on stage in front of over 200 investors, analysts, and journalists. The room went quiet the moment they saw his expression. I need to address the situation before we begin, Richard said, his voice steady and serious. About 15 minutes ago, our security team detected unauthorized access to our systems. We're investigating the scope of the breach. Out of caution, I'm postponing this presentation until we have more information. The room erupted immediately. Investors pulled out phones, checking TechVision's stock price. Journalists rushed for the exits to file breaking stories. And on the monitors in Michelle's secure room downstairs, the stock price began its controlled fall. $48 at open, $46 at 10:05, $43 at 10:15, $38 by 10:30, down 20% in less than 30 minutes as algorithmic trading systems detected the negative news and began selling automatically. And that's when Michael Hendricks made his move. The FBI's monitoring systems captured his first call at 10:32 a.m., Michael calling from his Cayman Islands residence to a known short seller in New York. The conversation was brief and coded, but completely clear to the agents listening in real time. The time had come. Execute the plan. Over the next hour, Michelle and Agent Quisenberry watched in tense silence as the FBI's systems documented a cascade of criminal activity. Michael made 17 calls to associates across his network. Millions of dollars began moving through offshore accounts, being positioned to short TechVision stock aggressively. Michael's shell corporation started placing buy orders, preparing to acquire shares of a company he expected to be worth almost nothing by end of day. Every transaction was being recorded. Every communication was being documented. Every order Michael gave was creating ironclad evidence that couldn't be explained away by any lawyer on earth. By 11:30, TechVision stock had fallen to $32 per share. The financial media was in full frenzy mode. Investors were panicking. And Michael Hendricks' network was making millions in profit while positioning themselves for a hostile takeover of TechVision's remains. At 11:45, Agent Quisenberry looked at Michelle and Richard. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were bright with the satisfaction of years of work finally paying off. We have enough. We have documented evidence of Michael Hendricks coordinating a criminal conspiracy to manipulate stock prices through fraud. We have his communications. We have the financial transactions. We can arrest him right now, and the charges will stick. Richard looked at Michelle. Your call.
This was your plan.
When do we end it? Michelle thought about her mother. About Grace Armstrong, who died believing she'd been foolish, believing she'd failed her children. About every family Michael had destroyed. About the arrogance of a man who'd spent 20 years believing he was completely untouchable. We don't just arrest him quietly, Michelle said. We expose him publicly.
Right now.
In front of everyone. We show the world exactly who he is and what he's done. At 12:15 p.m., Richard Wilson walked back on stage in TechVision's presentation hall. The room was quieter now, many investors having fled in panic. But the press was still there, cameras rolling, ready to document what they assumed would be a spectacular corporate collapse. Richard stood at the podium, and when he spoke, his voice was completely calm. Thank you for your patience this morning. I'm here to make a full statement and to reveal some information that I believe will shock every person in this room. He paused for exactly 3 seconds. The security breach you heard about was not real. It was a controlled simulation, designed and executed by our security team as part of an FBI operation to catch corporate criminals who have been targeting TechVision and dozens of other companies for over 20 years. The room erupted. Richard raised his hand for quiet, then gestured to the large screens behind him, which lit up with documents, transaction records, and communication logs. All of it. Every piece of evidence the FBI had gathered that morning and over years of investigation. What you're looking at is proof of a criminal enterprise that has destroyed hundreds of families and multiple companies over 2 decades. Michael Hendricks has operated with impunity for years, hiding behind shell corporations and offshore accounts. But this morning, we gave him enough rope to hang himself. When he saw TechVision appearing to fail, he couldn't help himself. He coordinated with his criminal network to profit from what he believed was our destruction. He gave orders. He moved money. He committed crimes in real time while the FBI documented every single move. Right now, arrest warrants are being executed in 3 countries. Michael Hendricks is being taken into custody in the Cayman Islands. His network of associates is being arrested in New York, London, and Hong Kong. And every dollar they stole, every hidden asset, is being seized. The silence in that room was absolute. Then Richard's voice shifted, becoming something more personal and more powerful than a corporate announcement. I want to say something clearly. This operation was not just about protecting my company. It was about justice for the victims Michael Hendricks has destroyed over more than 20 years. One of those victims was a woman named Grace Armstrong. 15 years ago, Michael stole her entire life savings through a fraudulent investment scheme. Grace died of cancer 3 years ago, bankrupt, believing she had failed her family. But Grace Armstrong did not fail. She was targeted by a professional predator who made a career of destroying people who trusted him. And today, her daughter Michelle Armstrong, who is TechVision's chief security officer and the person who designed this entire operation, made sure that predator finally ran out of road. Richard gestured to the wings of the stage. Michelle walked out, her legs trembling slightly, but her head completely steady. The cameras focused on her face, and she knew that somewhere across town, Aaron was watching this on television, finally understanding everything. My mother was a kindergarten teacher, Michelle said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the entire room. She spent 30 years helping children believe the world was fair. Michael Hendricks used that belief against her. He stole everything she had. And when she died feeling like she'd been foolish. But she wasn't foolish. She was the victim of a crime. And today that crime is finally answered. The room erupted in applause that felt nothing like polite corporate recognition. It felt like something much older and more human than that. It felt like relief. Like watching something broken finally be made right. 3 months later, Michelle stood in a hospital waiting room, holding terrible vending machine coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, trying not to pace. Aaron had been in surgery for 6 hours, receiving a kidney transplant from a matching donor. The operation was going well, the surgical team had said. But Michelle wouldn't settle until she could see her brother awake and breathing and himself. Richard sat beside her, having insisted on being there even though it was Saturday, and he had no obligation to be anywhere near a hospital waiting room. Over the past months, he'd become something she hadn't expected. A genuine friend. Someone who understood what it meant to fight for the people you love. When the surgeon finally appeared in the doorway, still in scrubs, still smiling, Michelle felt her legs go weak with relief. The transplant was successful, the surgeon said. Aaron's new kidney is functioning beautifully. He'll make a full recovery. Michelle couldn't speak. She just stood there in that sterile hallway with its faint smell of antiseptic and recycled air, feeling 2 years of fear and grief and exhaustion finally release their grip on her chest. Richard steadied her with a hand on her shoulder and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said.
That evening, sitting beside Aaron's hospital bed, watching him sleep off the anesthesia, Michelle thought about the long road that had led to this quiet room. The 18 months of double shifts and hidden talents and careful surveillance. The night in the restaurant when everything had changed. The trap they'd built and sprung and closed perfectly. Michael Hendricks was facing over 40 federal charges. His $300 million empire of stolen money had been seized and was being distributed to victims. Grace Armstrong's name was on that list. The restitution wouldn't bring her mother back. It wouldn't erase the pain of those years. But it meant Grace's suffering had been acknowledged, her victimization recognized, her memory honored. And it meant hundreds of other families would finally receive justice too. When Aaron woke up, groggy and disoriented but smiling, the first thing he said was, "Did it work? Am I okay?" Michelle squeezed his hand with both of hers. "You're perfect. You're going to be completely fine." Aaron's eyes filled with tears. Mom would have loved seeing this. Michelle felt her throat tighten. "She knows," she said softly. "Wherever she is, she knows. And she's proud of both of us." 6 months after the trap closed on Michael Hendricks, Michelle received a letter from a woman in Ohio. Her elderly parents had lost their retirement savings to one of Michael's schemes a decade earlier, and had been barely surviving ever since. Because of the Victim Restitution Fund, they were receiving their money back. The woman wrote 3 pages to thank Michelle for not giving up, for fighting back, for making sure her parents didn't die in poverty believing they'd been fools. Michelle kept that letter on her desk, along with dozens of others just like it. Reminders that her fight had never been only about her family. 1 year after that night in the Sterling Oak restaurant, Michelle stood at TechVision's IPO anniversary celebration. The stock price had tripled. The company had expanded into new markets. And TechVision was now known not just for its technology, but for its character. Richard gave a speech that spent more time on Michelle than on revenue numbers. "A year ago," he said, "a waitress saved my company by spotting an error my best engineers had missed. But what I couldn't have known then was that she would do something far more important than fix a line of code. She'd remind every single one of us what real strength actually looks like." After the celebration, Michelle drove to Aaron's apartment. He'd been living independently for months, healthy and working and finishing his degree, building the future their mother had always wanted for him. When Michelle arrived, he was cooking actual home-cooked food and playing music too loudly. They ate together, talking about ordinary things, classes and work and plans, the kind of normal conversation that had seemed impossible a year ago. And as Michelle listened to her brother laugh, full and healthy and alive, she let herself feel something she'd been afraid to feel for a very long time. Not the quiet of someone who'd stopped fighting, but the deep settled peace of someone who'd fought as hard as they could and won something real. She thought about that night in the restaurant, the 3 lines of code on a stranger's laptop, the choice she'd made to speak up instead of walking away. It had seemed so small at the time. But from that small moment of courage had grown something enormous. Justice for her mother. A future for her brother. And proof of something Grace Armstrong had spent her whole life teaching to other people's children. That honesty matters. That doing the right thing matters. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Grace Armstrong had lived that way. And her daughter had honored that legacy completely. If you were Michelle, would you have had the courage to spend 2 years in the shadows, hiding your talent and waiting for one chance to make it right? And to every person watching who has ever been wronged and told there was nothing that could be done, what would you say to them right now? Drop your answer in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that strength looks different on everyone, make sure you're subscribed because part 3 is coming. And the courtroom is only the beginning.